There is something happening to you that almost no one around you seems to notice, and that silence, that complete absence of acknowledgement, is itself part of the problem. You are sitting across from people who are speaking, and the words are technically arriving. The sentences are grammatically correct, the topics are appropriate, and yet something in you has gone very still. Not bored, not distracted. Still. As if your psyche has quietly stepped back from the glass and is watching the whole performance from a distance it did not choose. The conversation continues. You nod. You answer. And somewhere beneath all of that, something that used to respond to this, something that used to feel fed by human exchange, is not responding anymore. It is as though the words are passing through you rather than landing in you. You have probably tried to explain this to yourself in ways that made you smaller. You have called yourself antisocial, difficult, too sensitive, broken in some way that others seem not to be. You have watched people around you move through conversations with apparent ease, laughing at the right moments, energized by the back and forth, and you have wondered what is wrong with you that none of it reaches you the way it seems to reach them. Carl Jung would say that nothing is wrong with you. He would say that everything you are experiencing is pointing towards something important. Not a defect in your wiring, but a signal from the deepest layer of your psychological life. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what your psyche is doing when the words of others feel hollow, why collective conditioning has trained you to feel guilty for experiencing this, and what this particular kind of emptiness is actually preparing you to find. Stay with this. Let us begin with what you are actually experiencing, because it deserves to be named precisely rather than waved away. You are not simply having bad conversations. This is not about finding the right social circle or upgrading the people in your life. What is happening is something more fundamental, something that operates beneath the level of topics and personalities. It is a felt sense, almost physical, that the words being exchanged in most human interactions are moving along the surface of things without ever descending into what actually matters. You can be in a room full of noise and feel a kind of interior silence that no amount of volume seems able to touch. You can participate in the conversation, and some part of you can even perform it competently, and still leave the room feeling as though you have eaten an entire meal that contained no nourishment whatsoever. This experience has texture. It has specific qualities you would recognize immediately if someone described them accurately. There is the moment when someone says something they mean sincerely, something they are genuinely invested in, and you feel not warmth, not irritation, but a kind of quiet, almost sorrowful withdrawal, as if your inner life has tried to open a door toward theirs and found nothing behind it to respond to. There is the fatigue that follows social interactions that should, by every external measure, have been fine. The fatigue is not from effort. It is from the sustained management of a gap between what was being offered and what your psyche was hungry for. There is the loneliness that arrives not in solitude, but in company, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by speech that does not reach you. In Jungian psychology, the framework for understanding this begins with what Jung proposed as the distinction between the persona and the self. The persona, in Jung's theoretical framework, is the mask we construct to navigate social life, the collection of attitudes, behaviors, and conversational conventions that allow us to function in a collective world. Jung observed that most social exchange happens at the level of persona meeting persona. It is not dishonest, exactly. It is simply the currency of collective life, agreed upon surfaces, shared references, the reassuring repetition of familiar patterns. For many people, this exchange is genuinely satisfying. The persona is not a prison for them. It is a comfortable enough home. But some people, and you may be among them, carry a psychic hunger that the persona layer cannot satisfy. Their inner life runs deeper than the layer at which most social exchange occurs, not because they are superior, but because something in them has been oriented, perhaps since childhood, toward depth rather than surface. Think of a river whose bed lies significantly lower than the surrounding terrain. Water flowing across that terrain at normal speed simply cannot reach it. The river requires a different pressure, a different force of descent. Most social conversation flows at a level that never drops to where you actually live. and you feel that gap constantly, even when you cannot name it. This, Jung proposed, is not pathology. It is a specific psychological configuration, one that carries both its particular suffering and its particular purpose. But to understand what that purpose is, we first have to look honestly at what created the conditions that make this so painful. The emptiness you feel in conventional exchange did not arise from nowhere. It was prepared for you by a system of collective conditioning that has been operating, largely invisibly, for a very long time, and understanding that system is the first step toward releasing the guilt you may have been carrying for your own experience. We live inside a culture that has organized itself around extroversion as the default mode of human flourishing. This is not a personal observation. It is documented across multiple decades of psychological and sociological research. The sociologist David Reisman, writing in the mid-20th century, described the emergence of what he called the other-directed character, a personality type whose sense of self and well-being derives primarily from the approval and stimulation of others. Mass-produced, Reisman observed, not through deliberate conspiracy, but through the natural pressures of a social and economic system that required constant, frictionless interaction as its engine. Jung himself wrote extensively about what he called mass psychology, the tendency of collective life to flatten individual depth in favor of social efficiency and surface consensus. In his theoretical framework, one of the most powerful unspoken agreements governing modern life is this: that words exchanged between people constitute connection, and that the inability to feel nourished by those words is a personal failure of the individual who cannot receive them. Consider how pervasively this message operates. From childhood, you were placed in social environments, classrooms, family gatherings, playgrounds, where the ability to participate fluently in collective exchange was rewarded, and the tendency to withdraw into interior silence was corrected, treated with concern or quietly pathologized. The child who preferred to think rather than chatter, who felt drained rather than energized by group activities, who sat at the edge of the room watching rather than joining the noise, that child was rarely told that their experience was valid. They were told in countless subtle and not-so-subtle ways that something needed to be fixed, that they needed to try harder, be more social, come out of their shell. The shell, of course, was their inner life, and they were being asked to abandon it in order to be acceptable. Jung observed that when the collective shadow, the rejected, denied dimensions of a culture, grows powerful enough, it begins to shape what is possible for individuals to even perceive about themselves. In a culture that has systematically devalued depth, interiority, and the hunger for genuine meaning in exchange, the person who carries those qualities is left with no cultural mirror in which to see themselves accurately. They look around and find no language for what they are experiencing. They conclude they must be broken, because the alternative, that the culture itself is impoverished, is too disorienting to hold alone. This is not a small psychological cost, and you have been paying it for years, not because you are weak, not because you are antisocial, because a system organized around the surface never created the vocabulary you needed to understand your own depth. There is a real cost to remaining inside this confusion, to continuing to interpret your own experience through the distorted lens that collective conditioning has provided, and it is important to look at it clearly, not to create despair, but because clarity is the only ground from which something new can grow. When a person consistently experiences conventional social exchange as hollow and has no framework for understanding why, the most predictable psychological response is a kind of slow, quiet withdrawal from themselves, not from others only, from themselves. Because the question that eventually emerges, when the emptiness continues long enough, is not only why don't their words reach me, but why don't I seem to reach me either? The persistent inability to feel fed by the connections that appear to nourish everyone else gradually produces a kind of self-suspicion, a doubt about one's own reality, a sense that perhaps the problem lies so deep within that it is simply irremediable. In Jungian psychology, this trajectory can be understood as what Jung described as the abaissement du niveau mental, a lowering of the psychic level, a draining away of vital energy that occurs when the psyche cannot find a channel adequate to its actual needs. This is theoretical framework, not clinical diagnosis, but the phenomenology it describes is precise: a listlessness, a difficulty sustaining interest in activities that once felt meaningful, a sense of going through the motions of a life rather than actually inhabiting one. Jung proposed this condition arises specifically when the inner life has no adequate outlet, when the depth of the psyche cannot find correspondence in the outer world and gradually turns its energy inward in ways that become increasingly constricted. Consider Marcus. He was a man in his late 30s, well-educated, professionally capable, with a life that looked from the outside exactly as it was supposed to look. He had friends. He attended dinners. He participated in conversations about work, about travel, about the ordinary textures of adult life. And every evening, returning home, he felt a weight he had no words for. Not sadness exactly, not loneliness in any conventional sense, more like the feeling of a musician who has spent the entire day surrounded by people who can only hum, surrounded by sound, but deprived of music. He began to wonder if something fundamental in him had simply stopped working. The thought frightened him more than the emptiness itself, because it seemed to close a door he didn't know how to open from the other side. What is the price Marcus was paying? He was spending his vital energy not on living, but on managing the gap between the depth at which his psyche operated and the level at which the world around him moved. That is an enormous expenditure, and it leaves less and less available for the work of actually finding what the psyche is genuinely reaching for. The longer that gap goes unnamed, the more the person begins to mistake the management of absence for the condition of life itself. What would it mean if the emptiness you feel in other people's words is not a sign that you are broken? What would it mean if it were pointing towards something rather than away from everything? Here is the inversion that Carl Jung's framework makes possible, and it is one that may rearrange something fundamental in how you understand your own experience. What your family, your social world, or the culture at large may have called coldness, disconnection, inability to relate, or excessive sensitivity to meaninglessness is, in Jung's theoretical framework, actually the signature of a psyche that has begun to orient toward what Jung called the self, the deeper organizing center of the personality that lies beyond the persona, beyond social performance, beyond the exchange of surface words. The emptiness you feel in hollow conversation is not your failure to connect. It is your psyche's refusal to mistake the surface for the depth. It is, in the most precise Jungian sense, a form of psychological perception. The perception that something essential is absent from what is being offered. Jung proposed that the process of individuation, the lifelong movement towards psychological wholeness, requires at some point a growing inability to be satisfied by what previously satisfied the collective self. This is not a comfortable experience. It does not announce itself with clarity or comfort. It announces itself through a creeping sense that the things that are supposed to feed you have stopped feeding you, that the conversations that are supposed to make you feel less alone are leaving you feeling more alone, that the approved channels of human meaning are running dry in a way you cannot explain to anyone, because the very language for explaining it doesn't exist within the collective framework you've been handed. Think of the seed breaking open underground. From the outside, and this is critical, it looks like destruction. The casing that protected the seed is rupturing. Its structure, the form that preserved it through the cold months, is dissolving. There is no visible evidence from the surface that anything beneficial is occurring. The dissolution looks like loss because it is loss. What is being lost is the capacity to be contained by a form that was never meant to be permanent. And what is being born, slowly without announcement in the dark, is the first root, the reach towards something real enough to sustain a larger life. This is what the emptiness in others' words may be signaling. Not the death of your capacity for connection, the death of your capacity to be satisfied by connections that cannot reach you at the depth where you actually live. Not cynicism, not damage, but the beginning of an orientation toward what is real. You cannot unsee this. You will hear a hollow exchange, and you will never again be able to fully believe it is your failure that you cannot be nourished by it. That knowledge is uncomfortable. It is also precise. There is an analogy from navigation that illuminates what is happening in you with particular clarity. and I want to sit inside it for a moment before we move forward. Imagine a compass in a room filled with iron and magnetized objects. The needle does not stop working, but it is being pulled in multiple directions by competing fields. Someone who doesn't understand how compasses function might look at that needle, trembling and uncertain, and conclude that the instrument itself is broken. They might even attempt to correct it by holding it steady, by forcing the needle to point in the direction most of the other instruments seem to point, by concluding that the deviation is an error. But the compass is not broken. It is highly sensitive. It is doing exactly what it was built to do, respond to what is actually there. The problem is not the compass. The problem is a room that has been filled with magnetic noise. Your psyche, in the presence of hollow exchange, is not malfunctioning. It is responding with extraordinary sensitivity to the absence of something it is oriented toward. It is a compass in a room full of noise, still reaching for magnetic north, still trembling toward the thing that actually holds meaning, unable to rest in the direction the surrounding field is pushing it. The trembling is not weakness, it is fidelity. Consider Amara. She had spent most of her adult life trying to fix her compass. She attended more social events, pushed herself through more conversations, told herself she was being unfair to people around her who were perfectly decent human beings offering perfectly ordinary connection. She became very skilled at performing participation, and the more skilled she became, the more hollow she felt, because the performance consumed exactly the energy that might have been available for genuine reaching. One evening, at a gathering where she had executed her social performance with what she privately considered professional precision, she stepped outside onto a narrow balcony and stood in the cold for a long time. Something shifted in that stillness. Not an epiphany, nothing so dramatic. More like a quiet, almost reluctant admission. She was exhausted not by effort, but by the sustained pretense that surface was enough. If you have ever felt this, leave a comment below. Just a word. You are not alone in this. What Amara began to discover, slowly and without a clear map, was that the longing she had been trying to suppress, the longing for exchange that actually descended to where she lived, was not a defect in her social character. It was a compass. It was directing her, however imprecisely, toward the kinds of encounters, the kinds of pursuits, and eventually the kind of interior relationship with herself that could actually satisfy what she had been reaching for. The transformation was not that she stopped feeling the emptiness. The transformation was that she stopped treating the emptiness as evidence of her inadequacy and began treating it as information. But here is where this conversation has to become honest in a way that most conversations about psychological growth refuse to be. What we have been calling emptiness, when understood as a compass rather than a defect, still requires something from you, and that something is not comfortable. What must die, and I use that word in its strictly psychological sense, the death of a structure within the psyche rather than anything literal, what must die is the identity of the person who is broken. This may sound like a small thing, even a welcome thing, but it is not, because the identity of being broken, however painful, carries its own strange consolation. It provides an explanation. It provides a reason not to require more of life, not to reach toward depth that the surrounding world may not reflect back to you. The person who is broken is absolved of the terrifying task of living as though their hunger for meaning is legitimate. What must also die is the hope that the right conversation, the right person, the right relationship will finally deliver the nourishment you have been waiting for without requiring you to do the deeper work of finding what feeds you. This is perhaps the most difficult surrender of all, because the longing for someone else to be the solution, for another human being to finally be deep enough, present enough, real enough to close the gap, is an entirely human and entirely understandable response to years of emptiness. But in Jung's framework, the nourishment that is most essentially needed cannot come from another person's words. It comes from the encounter between the ego and the self, the meeting of the conscious personality with the deeper organizing center that individuation calls you toward. The persona you have been maintaining, the functional, socially competent surface self who has learned to perform connection while not quite touching it, that persona is also asked to loosen its grip. This is genuinely painful. Not because the persona is bad, but because it has been your protection. It has been the way you kept yourself legible to a world that would otherwise have found you difficult to categorize. Releasing it does not mean becoming illegible. It means allowing something more authentic to gradually take its place, even when that something has no guarantee of being received by the world around you. Jung knew this territory with specific biographical intimacy. After his break with Sigmund Freud in 1913, a rupture that left him professionally isolated and personally shaken, Jung entered what biographers and scholars have documented as a sustained period of psychological upheaval. He described in memories, dreams, reflections, an incessant flood of inner material, visions and fantasies that he feared might overwhelm his capacity to remain oriented. His professional identity, the entire framework within which his previous life had made sense, had come apart. He did not paper over the rupture with immediate reconstruction. He descended into it. He recorded what he found in what would become his Red Book, hundreds of pages of calligraphic text and paintings, a man sitting in the rubble of one life, working to understand what the rubble was asking him to build next. He built Bollingen Tower during those years, a stone structure on the shore of Lake Zurich, adding rooms to it across decades as different aspects of his psychological life were integrated. He called it his most difficult experiment. Jung would tell you that the dying is not the end of the process, it is the beginning of the only process that leads anywhere real. What becomes possible on the other side of this, and it is a possibility, not a promise, is a relationship with meaning that does not depend on others' words to validate it. What emerges is not a version of you that no longer needs genuine human connection. That need is real, and it belongs to you without apology. What emerges is a capacity to recognize genuine connection when it arrives, rather than mistaking the performance of it for the thing itself. The person who has done this work begins to carry an interior compass that is no longer easily thrown by the surrounding magnetic noise. They can enter a room full of hollow exchange and know without distress that they are simply in a room full of hollow exchange. They do not need to fix it. They do not need to pretend it is otherwise. And they are no longer devastated by it, because they have found, gradually, unevenly, at considerable cost, sources of nourishment that do not require the room to be something it isn't. What also becomes possible is the specific kind of human encounter that a person with this depth of inner life is actually capable of. Because the same sensitivity that makes hollow conversation exhausting is the sensitivity that makes genuine encounter, when it occurs, extraordinarily real. The person who has been hurt by superficiality knows the difference between the surface and the depth in ways that someone who has never felt that difference cannot. When they meet someone who speaks from the depth, they recognize it immediately, not with relief exactly, with recognition, as if two instruments that have been searching independently for the same frequency have finally, for a moment, found each other. Those moments are not frequent. They do not need to be. Jung observed in writings documented in his collected works that the process of individuation does not isolate the person from community. It eventually deepens their capacity for a particular kind of community, one rooted not in the exchange of personas, but in the meeting of genuine persons. There is a woman, Milena, who after years of treating her sensitivity to emptiness as a wound to be managed, arrived at a place where she described it as something more like discernment, not pride. Discernment, the ability to know what she was in the presence of and to choose accordingly. And when a person reaches this, something that Jung in his own documented words described as the kindling of a light in the darkness of mere being becomes the felt reality of even ordinary moments. The words of others do not need to carry meaning to sustain that light, because the light, at last, is coming from somewhere they can reach on their own. When the emptiness finally teaches you what it came to teach, it does not disappear. It becomes the measure by which you recognize everything real. You are not broken. You are not cold. You are not incapable of connection. You are a person whose psyche operates at a depth that most of the words being spoken around you were never built to reach. And the fact that you have felt the gap between where you live and where most conversation moves does not make you defective. It makes you honest in a way that most people are never required to be. What you are going through is not a sign that something has gone wrong with you. It is a sign that something is beginning to go right, that your psyche is refusing to continue accepting surface in place of substance, that the self at your center is pressing against the persona you have built to contain it, that the individuation process Carl Jung described as the most demanding and the most essential work a human being can undertake is, quietly and without fanfare, already underway in you. Not because you chose it, not because you are ready, because you could not stop it if you tried. If this gave language to something you have been living in silence, share it with someone who is living the same thing but has no words for it yet. That person is out there. They are exhausted in their own room, surrounded by words that cannot reach them, wondering if they are the only one. They need to know they are not alone.